Hi, this is Dr. Marshall, and this is the second video of part 2 of the external and internal directional and locational anatomy. Hopefully we can get through this with this one last video. And so we were starting to talk about the ventral body cavity. And the ventral body cavity, meaning toward the belly or toward the front of, refers to the body cavity that contains the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic organs. Okay, and this body cavity is further divided into, and I'm using the notes feature again to type out the answers, is further divided into the thoracic, and abdominal, pelvic cavities, and it's divided by the diaphragm. Okay, the physical diaphragm here is what's dividing that. So there is actually a physical barrier between the two spaces. The abdominal pelvic cavity can also be separated into two cavities for the abdominal and pelvic organs, but this is actually one large continuous cavity, and you can see that here, just one large continuous cavity. And the distinction is that the portion surrounded by the pelvic girdle is going to be the pelvic cavity. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Before we discuss the structure and terminology of these cavities, we need to consider an additional piece of information. So if you look at the following illustration, we've got a heavy ball of some type being dropped into a balloon. And notice that as the ball falls deeper and deeper and deeper into the balloon, the pushing in of the ball into the balloon creates two layers of the balloon. So there's an outer layer and then there's an inner layer that's wrapped tightly around the ball. Okay, so that inner layer is going to be wrapped tightly around the ball, and the outer layer will be separated from that by a cushion of air. So the inner layer is wrapped tightly around and is closely applied to the ball itself. So you can see that right at the arrow that inner layer is there. So in anatomical terms, a general term for organs of any type, is viscera. 47 is going to be viscera. And why is this important? So my gut is my viscera. So visceral is a word that is used to sort of imply a gut reaction. If I have a visceral reaction to something, I have a gut reaction to it. Okay, so it can be a literary term, but it also means the organ itself. So the stomach, the spleen, the liver, those are all viscera. Now, because of this, we'll say that this inner layer is the visceral surface, this layer that's attached to or is applied to the object, in this case a ball, and in the case of our organs, the organs, it's applied to the viscera. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. The outer layer is separated from the inner layer, in this case by a thin cushion of air, and if you think of this outer layer as forming a wall around the viscera, okay, so the inner layer is the visceral layer, but this outer layer forms a wall around the cavity, and the anatomical term for wall is literally the anatomical term parietal literally means wall. So we're going to call this the parietal surface. Okay, this is going to be the parietal surface. Now, envision the heart, lungs, and abdominal pelvic organs pushing into their respective cavities in much of the same way as we talked about for the ball into a balloon, recognizing also that I'm using fairly formless shapes to represent organs, just something that makes this illustration as easy as possible. And the names of the three cavities in which the heart, lungs, and abdominal pelvic organs are going to be in is going to be the pericardial, pleural, and abdominal pelvic. Abdominal pelvic. Okay, so these are the three different cavities: the pericardial and not the abdominal pelvic. The abdominal, the pericardial, the pleural, and the peritoneal. Let's try that. Peritoneal cavities. Okay, peritoneal cavities. Okay, go to the next slide. So for the pericardial cavity, this is the cavity for the heart. Notice, just like with the ball, we sort of dropped the heart into this balloon of the pericardial cavity here. So this whole space right here is the cavity. It's just that the heart is filling up most of it. Okay, and notice that we applied the terms that we've already learned to the pericardial cavity itself, the pericardial wall, the peritoneum, the visceral and the pleural peritoneum. So there's the visceral and there's the pleural peritoneum. Or, I'm sorry, pericardium. So the parietal surface, which is the surface that lines the wall of the cavity, becomes the parietal pericardium. So that's 52. The parietal pericardium. And the visceral surface, which is the surface that directly covers the surface of the heart, becomes the visceral pericardium. Go on to the next slide and look at the pleural cavity, okay, where the lungs reside, the pleural cavities. Now, okay, so the pleural cavity is similar to the pericardium. We have this inner and outer surface here, and so the inner surface is going to be called the visceral pleura, and then the outer surface is going to be called the parietal pleura. And especially with the heart and lungs, there's a particular symptom that's associated with inflammation of the pericardium or the pleura, and that's called a pericardial or a pleural rub. And when the surface of these things gets inflamed, when these surfaces get inflamed, they can rub against each other, and they can cause a sound in the stethoscope. So that's an important finding. Is going to usually indicate an inflammation of some type of the pleural or pericardial surface. Okay. Another thing that can happen in these cavities is that we can, because of the inflammation, we can collect fluid, and that's called an effusion. So a pericardial effusion or a pleural effusion, and those need to be drained in order for the lungs or the heart to function properly. And we can also get diagnostic material to culture for infections to see what kind of infectious processes might be going on. So those are just some features of the pericardial and pleural cavities. If we go to the next slide, we also have the abdominal cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity, and I've just represented the abdominal pelvic organs as one giant organ here, but recognize that the visceral peritoneum is closely applied to all of the organs individually, and then the parietal peritoneum is just on the wall of the abdominal cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity. We call this the parietal and visceral peritoneum, 56 and 57 there. And again, we can accumulate fluid in here if there's inflammation, or if bacteria gain access to this, we can actually get pus building up in there. Especially in the abdominal cavity, the linings of the abdominal cavity are extremely sensitive to pain. And so, for example, appendicitis, if we rupture the appendix and the material inside the appendix gains access to the abdominal pelvic cavity, then this causes very, very, very intense pain. Okay, so those are the cavities, the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity, and then in the thoracic cavity we have the individual pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity. And then just one last slide here just to show some relationships. I've got the lungs and the heart here, and I just wanted you to see the relationship of the pericardial sac or the pericardial cavity or the pericardial space here to the pleural cavity, the pleural spaces. They're just right next door to each other. Okay, so I've got the heart here inside the pericardial cavity. I've got the lungs inside the pleural cavities there. Okay, so that should do it for this video. So now this is completed part 2 of the external and internal directional and locational anatomy. There are some quizzes associated with this. Look for those in the question of the day thing, assignments, and I will get those up shortly. So hopefully things are going to come a lot quicker now. Anyway, this is the end of that video, so go ahead and complete the assignment, turn the form in, and complete the Nearpod, and I'll get those graded. Talk to you later.